everyone, I'm your host Cadence, and welcome back to another episode of Project Honesty, a podcast designed for young adults, by a young adult, to gain brutally honest, friend-like advice, as well as provide a platform for young adults to form opinions, color outside of the lines, take deep dives into current events, and most importantly, have fun. This is Project Honesty, navigating reality with real conversations and diverse opinions. If you haven't already, go check out last week's episode called The Price of Tomorrow, Youth, Money, and Inflation. The cost of living has skyrocketed, leaving the dream life far out of reach for many, especially the younger generation. Inflation affecting even basic necessities has left many Canadian families hanging on by a thread and having to rely on government sources to stay afloat. This episode is available on Spotify and YouTube. Today's topic, you might have heard it in the news. If you've seen our weekly episode release post, you would have seen the topic on Instagram at project_honesty24. Go follow. Today, we're going to be talking about the new Taliban rules against women. I'm deciding to talk about this for a variety of reasons, some of them probably obvious, at least most of them are obvious. I'm a feminist, and on here I talk about how women should be empowered to use their voices and use their voices how they like, speaking their truth and pushing against societal boundaries that limit our expression. As females already in society, we have a tough time, and so when there are rules put on our voice, it just further limits our self-expression. It's very important to me because my privileges that I have as a Canadian woman, I have the right to a proper education, I have the right to vote, I have the right to speak, I have the right to write, I have the right to dress the way I want, identify how I choose, just things we all think of in the Western world and a lot of countries across the world as just basic rights. So jumping right into it, I want to talk about the past. So the Taliban, starting in the early 1990s, after Soviet troops pulled out of the region, the Taliban, or known as students in the Pashto language, emerged from northern Pakistan. They practice and follow extreme Islamic laws, but they promised peace, human rights, and security. This progressed to the point where in 1998, the Taliban had control over around 90% of Afghanistan, which is a lot. In the beginning, relatively speaking, the Taliban was okay. In other words, they weren't causing any problems. The problems really started, and a lot of catalyst events started in the early 2000s, where they started to introduce and practice their restrictive interpretation of Sharia law. So this included public executions for those who committed crimes, as well as amputations for people that were committed of theft. And then they also required men to grow beards, and women were required to start wearing a full cover burqa. If you don't know what that is, I think I'll make a post on Instagram about it. If not, just go Google full cover burqa and then you'll know what I'm saying. In the early 2000s, we see that kind of catalyst event leading up to this rule of Taliban extremism. So this developed further when the Taliban banned music and television. Girls over the age of 10 were forbidden from attending school. There was a lot of cultural abuses that took place, and what I mean by cultural abuses is, for example, in 2001, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddha that was in central Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, that held so much cultural significance not only to the people in Afghanistan, but also internationally. The Taliban destroyed that, so that is an example of one of the cultural abuses that were committed by the Taliban. The Taliban committed murders against journalists and protesters who stood up for human rights, so the people that would speak against these laws and the things that they were putting in place that they didn't necessarily agree with. These laws only got more extreme when, for example, to travel long distances, Afghani women needed a male escort, and their face needed to be covered at all times in public. When researching for this episode and writing this episode, it reminded me of a time, I think I was in grade 7, I read a book called The Breadwinner, and it follows a journey of a young girl who had to act and dress like a boy because her father was ill, from what I remember. obviously her mom couldn't go out by herself, and they didn't have a brother, and her sister was gone. So this young girl, I believe her name was Parvana in the story, she had to act like a boy just so that her family could survive. It's a really amazing story, so you can go Google The Breadwinner, go buy the book even if you want. It's an amazing book, and I honestly learned a lot. And another thing about these extremist rules in the early 2000s was that the majority of women in the country were not permitted to work. Now, I say the majority because there were some women who were still able to work. I believe it was like nurses and teachers, like professors and things. But other than that, women didn't necessarily work in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. In 2012, an event took place that shocked the world, and it's a really famous event. So in October of 2012, a Taliban plotted attack, shooting of a young schoolgirl named Malala Yousafzai. They shot her in the face on her way home from school. The now well-known activist Malala continues her work of advocating for women in Afghanistan and their rights. I think she currently lives in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think she lives in the UK. She also actively speaks up and out against the Taliban regime. So this event in 2012 of Malala getting shot in the face on her way home from school was something that almost seemed like a turning point in this regime. It seemed like things were really going downhill at this point. And so we also see more progression of Taliban rule at this time. So then families started receiving home visits by Taliban soldiers to make sure that they were complying with Taliban rule. So women being covered up, things like that. And throughout this time, so throughout like the early, I think it was like 2010s till like the 2020-ish, there was a lot of American military presence in the region. They intervened on multiple occasions in efforts to give the power back to the Afghan government. This didn't actually end up working long term because then in 2021, Taliban militants took over Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, on August 15th. So they regained full control of the country. Naturally, this led to many protests, some even led by females, to show their disapproval and non-compliance with this new Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. A lot of these protesters were injured by Taliban soldiers, some even captured and killed because of their protests. And so kind of the point to this episode and what really inspired me to talk about this episode is the new rules that are forced upon these women in 2024. It was about a week ago. So women now, currently living in Afghanistan, are forbidden from speaking in public, writing, and full body coverings are required at all times. To be specific, the law states, quote, "Whenever an adult woman leaves her home, she must conceal her voice, face, and body." BBC journalists in Kabul have been able to talk to some female activists. One woman named Shabana said, "If we can't speak, why even live? We are like dead bodies moving around." Another activist named Nasheen said, quote, "Every moment you feel like you're in prison. Even breathing has become difficult here." What does this mean for the women of Afghanistan and their future? It is drastically changed now. And without having the right to an education or a full education, a voice or identity for that matter, what does this mean for the women? When will these rules change? When will these women get their voice back? From my perspective, it's so important as someone who was born and raised in Western Canada and a woman who has the right to speak, to dress how I please, to have an education, to go places without a male escort. It's important and vital for me to use my platform to speak up and publicly recognize this corruption and violation of human rights. Because women are humans. And it seems like in these Taliban laws that women aren't humans. The fact that they cannot use their voice is just the prime example of what it means to take away human rights from someone. And it's hard to wrap your head around, honestly, as someone who was born and raised in Western Canada. That would never in a million years happen here. And it's still happening in the same world. And that's why it's also important that everyone knows what's happening. So because this issue may not be at home, yet it still holds great importance. Because it may be on the other side of the world. It may be in a different continent, whatever. But we all live on the same rock. And so it's very important for us to know what is happening on this rock. To even get the privilege to say that you have an understanding of the world, you should know that this is happening. This new set of rules for Afghan women has made me take a step back and realize the privileges that I have as a Canadian woman, and the opportunities that these women couldn't even express the want to have. And some of those opportunities I have on a daily basis. And so it really, really makes me step back and look at what I have. And it brings a lot of gratitude that my government doesn't place rules on my voice or my body. Furthermore, my government simply respects the fact that I exist as a woman, which is something women in Afghanistan don't experience because their government honestly doesn't even recognize them as people. So this episode was shorter, but I want you to take a moment to yourself and just reflect on what was said. If you're a woman, I would want you to think what would happen if this were you. If you're not a woman, I would like you to just take a second to just think about how damaging this can be for someone, because this is damaging. Not being able to use your voice is damaging. And so I just want you to take a second and really receive that information, because it's so, so important. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can find Project Honesty on Spotify at Project Honesty or on YouTube at Project_Honesty. To keep up to date with new episodes, you can head over to Project Honesty's Instagram, which is at Project_Honesty24. You can also check out our TikTok, which is at Project.Honesty. We now also have a website that was released, I believe, a week and a half ago. The link for the website is in our Instagram bio. And to help spread this podcast everywhere, tell a friend or share with family about Project Honesty, and you can direct them over to the Instagram, the TikTok, Spotify, YouTube, or the website to help them learn more. Subscribe, follow, and click the bell icon for updates when I post. And remember, the more listeners, the bigger the family.